Wyoming, winter 1886. The cold here is like no other. It not only bites the skin, but penetrates the bones, making even breathing sound like cracking ice. In the small town of Red Mesa, the wind whistles down the main street, blowing dustings of snow off the slanted sign of the Copper Spurs saloon. That morning, the townspeople gathered in the market square, where the auction of debts was taking place. A skinny horse, a carriage with broken wheels, and, strangely enough, a girl stood by the stables, her wrists bound with old leather. Calder Holt, a lonely farmer living far out in the valley, reined in his horse as he passed. He had only come to buy some wire and seed, but the roar of laughter from the crowd stopped him. "This man's debt," the deputy sheriff shouted, including his dependents. "Here she is, fatherless, homeless, voiceless, to the highest bidder." The girl was about 18, her hair disheveled, her face streaked with ash, her feet bare in the snow. Her eyes were not looking for anyone to plead with, but were staring into the distance, as if she heard something in the wind. A man in the crowd, drunk, smelling of alcohol, growled, "She is deaf and mute. She can clean up, no argument. It's cheap." The whole crowd burst into laughter. Calder clenched his gloves. He turned to leave. The world was none of his business. But when he turned back, the girl's eyes were fixed on him. Not despair, not fear, just silence, deep and bright, as if looking through the falling snow. There was a dry crack. The wooden beams of the auction floor had snapped in two after last night's storm. The crowd broke apart, backing away. The horse kicked in panic. The rope in the girl's hand stretched, pulling her back, almost toppling her off the platform. Without thinking, Calder leapt forward and grabbed her arm. The pull was so strong that he slid into the snow with her, both of them tumbling in a cloud of cold dust. The horse jerked its leash, neighing and galloping toward the main road. A shout echoed through the square. Calder jumped up and held the girl's hand, who was shivering with cold. The deputy chief gasped, "You'll be in debt if you save her, Holt. She's on the books. You can sign for the whole lot if you want." The girl continued to look at him, silent, but her eyes made his heart skip a beat. He pulled out his wallet and tossed the last of his coins onto the wooden table. "My name," he said softly. The crowd roared, a few whistles jeering. Calder helped her to her feet. The leather strap slipped from her wrist and fell into the snow. He led her to the carriage, draping his thick cloak over her shoulders. As the carriage rolled out of town, the wind swept away all the laughter. The girl looked out at the vast white fields, her lips moving soundlessly. Calder sat beside her, silently driving through the snowy fields. He didn't know if he had done right or wrong, but he knew there was something in those eyes that made it impossible for him to leave. In the gray sky, thunder rumbled like a distant warning, a sign that winter would bring not only snow, but also a mystery that could change his life forever. Dusk bled into the snowfields, like ink in water. Calder Holt drove the wagon through a valley so still it seemed carved from glass, the mare's breath pluming white ribbons that vanished before they reached the stars. The girl, she hadn't given a name, sat on a sack of feed, wrapped in an old blanket he'd thrown back without thinking. Her lips were blue, her hands were clasped so tight he could see the bones. They didn't speak. He wouldn't have known what to say. Every jolt of the wheel sent a shiver through her thin frame. But she didn't complain. She didn't do anything but stare at the road, as if it were a sentence she had to read until the end. By the time they reached Holt's ranch, the moon was up and the cold had teeth. The place looked like it always did, lonely, half-lit, wind gnawing at the shutters. But tonight, for the first time in years, Calder felt like a trespasser in his own land. He helped her down, but when she set foot on the ground, she stumbled. Reflex made him reach for her arm. The contact was brief but electric. She flinched as though the touch burned. He saw it then, beneath the grime on her sleeve. Bruises, old and new, running the length of her forearm like storm shadows. Inside, he lit the lamp, and the small cabin sighed awake. The mare's stable was still warm from the day's sun. He left her there and came back to find the girl standing by the hearth, staring at the flame as if she'd never seen one up close. He pointed to a chair. "Sit." No answer. He tried again, slower. "You can rest." She blinked, uncertain, then moved like a wild creature testing a snare. When she sat, the blanket slipped from her shoulder, revealing the neckline of her dress, frayed, stained, and cut too wide. Around her neck hung a strip of leather, not jewelry, but a remnant of some old collar. He realized she hadn't owned anything that wasn't used to tie her down. Calder poured coffee, hesitated, then set it in front of her. Steam curled between them. She didn't reach for it. Instead, she looked at the tin cup as though remembering something, then flinched when the log in the fire popped. Her hand flew to her ear. Not deaf, he thought. Just hunted. Outside, the wind keened through the eaves. A coyote answered from far off, lonely as prayer. Calder poured himself another cup and sat opposite her. He noticed the tremor in her fingers, the way she kept glancing toward the door as if expecting it to burst open. "Who was he?" Calder asked quietly. "The man at the auction?" She didn't meet his eyes. Her hands moved instead, awkward, halting. Two gestures repeated, one like the swing of a bottle, another that mimed a slap. Then she pointed to the bruise on her arm. He understood enough. The silence that followed was heavier than grief. It was the sound of someone remembering in real time. When she finally looked up, her eyes were wet, but unbroken. She lifted one hand and made a motion, fingers brushing past her cheek, downward like a falling tear. Then she pressed her palm flat to her chest. "My name," she mouthed soundlessly. "Mara." He repeated it, careful. "Mara." The words seemed to fill the room in a way his own name never had. That night, he gave her the small cot near the stove and took the chair by the window. Snow thickened outside until the world vanished behind it. The lamp guttered low. Calder's eyes closed, but sleep refused him. Each time the wind rattled the door, he thought of that look she'd given him at the station, steady, defiant, already belonging to something larger than him or this ranch. Near dawn, a sound woke him. Not a scream, not even a cry, just a muffled gasp, the kind made when someone's dream turns too close to memory. He turned. Mara sat upright on the cot, eyes wide, hands clutched to her throat. He moved slowly toward her. "It's all right," he murmured. "You're safe here." She shook her head violently. Then she did something that froze him. She pressed both palms to the wooden wall, trembling. When he followed her gaze, he saw why. Outside, barely visible through the frost, a shadow moved past the window. Not an animal. Boot prints marked the snow beneath the eave, fresh, deliberate, leading straight from the road to his door. Calder reached for his rifle. Whoever had come had done so quiet as sin, and if the girl's trembling was any sign, she already knew exactly who it was. The handle turned once, slowly. Mara made no sound. She only looked at Calder, her eyes wide with that same eerie understanding as before. She didn't need to hear the danger to know it was there. And as the wind died outside, the door began to creak open. The tragedy deepens here. Mara's past has followed her into the wilderness, and Calder's solitude is no longer his own. What unfolds next isn't just rescue. It's reckoning, both with the men who broke her and the silence that shaped them both. Snow whispered against the windows as night dropped over Holt's ranch. Calder had meant only to keep her safe for a few days, feed her, let her find her bearings, then send her to the mission in town. But now the girl sat rigid by the fire, her fingers knotted in the blanket, eyes fixed on the door, as if something waited beyond it. He'd seen fear before. This wasn't fear. This was memory. When the first knock came, it wasn't loud. Just 3 slow thuds that made the lamp tremble. Calder crossed the room, rifle ready. Outside stood a man swaying in the snowlight, his coat soaked and collar turned high. "Looking for a runaway," he said, words slurred, but not from drink. "Name's Mara. My property." Calder felt the heat rise in his chest. "There's no property here but land and stock." The man grinned, teeth yellow. "You bought what was mine. Now I've come to collect." Behind Calder, the girl gave a small breath, half sob, half whisper. It was the first sound he'd heard from her. He didn't turn. "You should ride," he said to the man. "Storm's closing in." The man's grin faltered. His hand twitched toward the revolver at his hip. "She owes me. She cost me coin and a year's labor." Calder's voice dropped. "She owes you nothing." For a moment, the world balanced on the thin edge of that sentence. Then the man spat, cursed, and stalked back to his horse. The hooves faded into the blizzard. Inside, Mara still stared at the door. The blanket had slipped from her shoulders. He could see the scar circling her wrist where the rope had been. When he knelt to pick it up, she flinched, then hesitated, confused by his gentleness. "You're safe," he said. She looked at him, lips trembling. Then with a shaking finger, she traced a line in the frost on the table. "He'll come again." He didn't know how she could write so neatly with hands that cold. Over the next days, the storm buried the world in white. Calder worked the drifts, chopped wood, mended the roof. Mara cleaned, mended, fed the animals, moving in silence like a ghost trying to relearn how to live. At night, she curled near the fire, watching it until dawn. On the 4th morning, Calder found the mare gone from her stall. So were Mara's shoes. Tracks led south across the flats. He saddled before thinking. The wind had a knife's edge. Snow drove sideways, erasing her footprints almost as fast as he followed them. He found her near the ridge, knees in the snow, arms wrapped around the mare's neck. The animal's side heaved. Blood darkened the drift where its hoof had split on hidden ice. Mara pressed her palms to the wound, desperate, whispering something without sound. Calder pulled her back. "It's no use," he said softly. "She's done." She shook her head, tears freezing on her cheeks. Her hands moved, swift, pleading shapes he didn't understand. But her eyes begged him not to stop trying. When the mare's breathing slowed, she laid her ear against its flank, listening until even the echo of a heartbeat was gone. Then she looked up at him, face hollow, and signed one simple thing. Sorry. He didn't know if she meant for the horse, or for herself, or for everything she'd ever lost. That night, back at the cabin, she wouldn't sit by the fire. She stood at the window, hand pressed to the glass, watching the ridge where the snow now covered the grave he'd dug. Her reflection looked like a ghost trying to walk back into the world. Calder wanted to say something, anything, but there was nothing to fix in words. Only the truth that tragedy, once it finds a soul, never quite leaves. Outside, the wind rose again. Somewhere in its howl, he thought he heard a faint echo, a sound not of fear, but of a girl who once refused to die quietly. Dawn came pale and brittle, the kind of cold that cracked the air before it touched skin. Calder woke to the smell of smoke. Wood, not danger, but enough to pull him fast from sleep. He stepped into the main room and found Mara kneeling by the stove, sleeves rolled up, arms streaked with ash. She'd been up before him again. "Didn't have to," he said, voice gravel from sleep. She glanced over her shoulder. a faint smile ghosting across her lips. Then she lifted her hands and signed, slow enough for him to catch. "Fire helps me think." He nodded, though the words caught somewhere between his ribs. She looked different that morning, less like a stray pulled from the snow and more like someone beginning to belong. But belonging, in Wyoming, always came with a cost. A week later, Calder rode to town for supplies. When he returned, he found boot prints by the barn that weren't his. Fresh, deep. He drew his rifle and circled wide. The door hung open, one hinge cracked. Inside, the mare's stall was empty, feed scattered. In the corner, Mara's shawl torn. He felt the cold before the fear. He followed the tracks into the canyon beyond the ridge, through snow that swallowed his boots, until he heard it. A muffled shout, the rough sound of struggle carried by the wind. At the creek bed, two men had her pinned. One of them the drunk from the auction, the other younger, with eyes too mean for his age. They hadn't heard Calder approach. He didn't call out. He fired once, high, splintering a branch just above their heads. The echo thundered through the canyon. "Let her go," he said. The younger man jerked back, hand halfway to his belt. But the older one sneered. "Thought we'd share what we was owed, Holt. You bought her cheap, figure we might take our turn collectin'." Mara's face was streaked with dirt, blood at the corner of her mouth. Her eyes met Calder's. Not pleading, just steady, fierce, alive. He fired again, this time close enough to singe fabric. The younger man broke first, stumbling backward into the drifts. The older one hesitated, drunk on arrogance and something darker, until Calder stepped closer and pressed the rifle to his chest. "Next shot goes through your heart," Calder said quietly, "and you won't hear it coming." The man spat once more but turned, trudging after his partner. Their shadows vanished into the trees. When they were gone, Calder dropped to one knee beside her. "You hurt?" She shook her head, but her hands trembled as she signed, "You shouldn't have come." He almost laughed. "You think I could stay away?" Her lip quivered, not from fear this time, but something else. She reached out, fingertips brushing the cut on his chin. "Blood," she mouthed, and smiled barely. He caught her wrist gently. "Yours or mine?" She looked at his hand still holding hers, then at his eyes. And for a moment, the world narrowed to the sound of wind between them. When they returned to the cabin, she refused the bed. Instead, she knelt by the hearth again, crushing herbs into a bowl with trembling hands. He sat beside her, watching the firelight play against her hair. "You knew they'd come?" he said. "Did you feel it?" She nodded once. Then she touched her chest, the same motion as before. "Here." He studied her a long time. "What else can you feel?" Her fingers paused. Then she reached out, slow, uncertain, and laid her palm against his heart. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Her hand was warm despite the chill. Calder could feel the tremor running through her fingers, the rhythm syncing with his own pulse until he couldn't tell whose heart was racing harder. She looked up, eyes catching the firelight. Then, wordlessly, she leaned forward, her forehead resting against his chest. The movement was fragile, cautious, but real. He lifted his hand, brushed a strand of hair from her cheek, and whispered, "You're safe now." She shook her head lightly against him, as if to say safety was never the point. Then she tilted her face upward, close enough for him to see the flicker of gold in her eyes. When their lips met, it wasn't perfect. It was desperate, uneven, almost clumsy. But it carried the weight of every silence they'd ever shared. Outside, the storm rolled in again, wind howling through the eaves. Inside, the fire flared, sparks rising like stars. And for the first time since the snow began to fall that winter, neither of them felt alone. The storm did not end that night. It only hid, gathering itself like a beast waiting to strike again. By morning, the sky was the color of iron, and the wind had teeth sharp enough to flay bark from trees. Calder knew it before he even stepped outside. Something in the air had turned. Mara was already awake, standing barefoot on the porch boards, staring toward the ridge. Her hair whipped in the wind, her eyes unfocused but alert. Calder pulled his coat around her shoulders. "You shouldn't be out here." She didn't move. She pressed her palms flat against the railing, then turned to him and signed one word. "Fire." He frowned. "Fire? Where?" She pointed west, toward the grazing fields. Nothing but snow and low fog. But she stood there, unmoving, eyes narrowing as if she were listening to something miles away. Then he smelled it. Smoke. By the time they reached the pasture, a dozen acres were already burning. The storm wind had turned the smallest spark into a wall of orange fury. The herd bellowed, trapped against the far fence. Calder's men wouldn't arrive for hours. The bridges were iced, the roads impassable. Mara broke into a run. Calder shouted for her to stop, but she didn't. She sprinted straight into the choking heat, skirts snapping around her legs, eyes fixed on the cattle. The air shimmered. The blaze roared high enough to swallow her whole, and yet she kept moving. Calder followed, lungs screaming, the rifle strap cutting into his shoulder. "Mara!" he coughed. "Get back!" But she was already at the herd. He watched in disbelief as she moved among them. No whip, no rope, only her hands. She pressed her palms to the flank of the lead steer, then to another, moving in strange, rhythmic patterns. Like conducting an invisible orchestra, the animals stilled. The panic broke. Slowly, impossibly, they began to turn, following her gestures toward the narrow creek bed that cut through the pasture. Calder caught up just as a burning branch crashed near them. He grabbed her arm. "You'll die out here." She shook her head and pointed. "This way." He didn't ask how she knew, he just ran. Together, they drove the herd toward the frozen creek, the fire chasing behind like a living thing. Calder's coat caught a spark. Mara slapped it out with her bare hand, skin blistering instantly. She didn't flinch. When the last steer crossed the icy water, Calder turned and saw the flames arching overhead, closing in around them. The world turned orange. Mara looked at him once. Calm, certain. She pointed to the slope above, then pressed a hand to the ground. "Up," he gasped. She nodded, mouthing the word he could almost read. Now, they scrambled up the incline, the earth soft from thaw, smoke clawing at their throats. Behind them, the pasture groaned, the old fence posts exploding in the heat. Calder reached the ridge and collapsed beside her, coughing black. The valley below was a bowl of fire. But the herd, every last animal, stood clustered by the frozen creek, safe. He turned to her. Her hands were shaking, skin raw and scorched, eyes wet but defiant. "You knew," he whispered. She nodded faintly, lips parting. "Felt the earth. Breathe wrong," she managed, voice hoarse from smoke. Calder stared, half in awe, half in fear. "You saved them," he said. "You saved us." She looked at him for a long moment, the wind whipping her hair across her face. Then she smiled, the kind of small, tremulous smile that broke a man open. Back at the cabin hours later, as snow began to fall again, Calder bandaged her hands. The skin was blistered, the edges raw, but she didn't wince. "You should rest," he murmured. She shook her head. With her uninjured hand, she traced letters across his palm. "You didn't see everything." "What do you mean?" She took his hand and pressed it against her chest, over her heart. Beneath his fingers, her pulse beat strong, steady, matching the rhythm of the wind outside. "When it burns," she whispered, voice soft but sure. "The earth tells me how to make it stop." He looked at her, really looked, and in that moment realized she was not fragile, not broken, not a mystery to be pitied. She was the storm's answer. Someone who could feel the land's warning before it screamed, who could read the heartbeat of a world most men had long forgotten to hear. Then, without thinking, he leaned forward. The space between them dissolved, and his lips met hers. Fierce, grateful, alive. Outside, the last embers died under falling snow. Inside, the fire in her eyes burned brighter than ever. That night, Calder Holt knew the truth. The girl he'd once thought silent could speak more loudly than thunder. And the man who had lived his whole life listening to the wind had finally heard his heart answer back. Spring found the valley before anyone believed it would. The last snow melted slow, dripping from the eaves like the land itself was sighing in relief. Grass pushed through blackened soil where the fire had burned, soft and green as forgiveness. Calder rebuilt the fences with steadier hands that year. Mara tended to the animals, coaxing life back into every scarred inch of earth. When the first calf was born, she stood beside the stall, eyes wide with quiet pride. Calder caught her watching him later, the kind of gaze that spoke in every language except words. By summer, laughter had returned to the ranch. Not the loud, careless kind, but a sound born of small joys. A coffee cup clinking on the table, a broom brushing across the porch, her soft hum carried by the evening wind. Sometimes she spoke, not much, just enough to let him know she was trying. Wind, warm, she'd say, or sky, kind. Calder would nod, though what she really said came through her hands, through the way she reached for his cheek when he was tired, or placed her palm over his chest when words failed him. One night, after the herd had settled and the stars came out like spilled sugar, Calder brought her to the ridge above the creek. The charred trees stood like sentinels, their shadows long in the moonlight. "Didn't think this land would live again," he said quietly. Mara smiled, tracing circles on his wrist with her thumb. "Land listens," she murmured. "If we listen back." He wrapped his arms around her and for the first time felt the peace he'd been chasing all his life. Not the quiet of loneliness, but the stillness of being understood. The kind of silence that sings. Years later, travelers passing through Red Mesa would talk about the ranch where a man and a woman seemed to move in perfect rhythm, where the cattle never panicked before a storm, and where children came to learn that listening could be more powerful than speech. They said the woman could feel the heartbeat of the earth itself, and the man who once lived alone had found a way to love the world through her. On warm evenings, Mara and Calder would sit beneath the cottonwood tree, her head resting against his shoulder, the sun melting behind the hills. She would sign slowly, her fingers graceful as a prayer. Home. He'd smile and answer aloud, "Yes, love. Home." The wind would rise, gentle now, carrying the scent of wildflowers through the grass. The same wind that once tore at them now wrapped around them like a blessing, that sometimes the world speaks in ways we forget to hear. Through the rustle of leaves, the ache of loss, the warmth of another's hand. That love is not about mending what's broken, but about listening closely enough to understand what still beats beneath the scars. Calder once thought silence was emptiness. Mara taught him it was just another kind of language. And in learning to listen, they found not just each other, but the hum of life itself, steady, forgiving, and endless.